The thing about the universe, as most civilized species had come to understand it, was that there existed a very clearly defined hierarchy of who could obliterate whom. At the top sat the Ur-Nathi Empire, a collection of crystalline beings who had perfected the art of converting stellar matter into weaponized annihilation. Below them sprawled approximately 47 other species, each occupying their designated rung on the ladder of cosmic firepower, all content with their positions because challenging the Ur-Nathi was roughly equivalent to arguing with a supernova about its brightness settings. The Ur-Nathi had held their position for approximately 16,000 standard cycles, which they considered a modest achievement. Their secret weapon, quite literally, was the Annihilation Lance, a device that could crack planets like eggs and reduce moons to their constituent atoms. They had used it exactly 42 times in recorded history, and each demonstration had successfully convinced entire star systems to reconsider their aggressive foreign policies. It was, as far as galactic deterrence went, remarkably effective. Nobody argued with a civilization that could delete your homeworld from existence before you finished your morning nutrient intake. The current border dispute between the Ur-Nathi and the Folur Concordat had been brewing for 3 standard years, which was precisely 2 years and 11 months longer than most conflicts involving the Ur-Nathi typically lasted. The Folur, insectoid creatures with an admirable but ultimately futile sense of territorial sovereignty, had made the catastrophic error of establishing mining colonies in a system the Ur-Nathi considered theirs by right of ancient claim. Ancient, in this context, meant roughly 200 cycles ago, which in galactic politics might as well have been yesterday, but the Ur-Nathi were not particularly interested in temporal nuance. Diplomacy had been attempted. 17 different mediating species had offered their service. Economic sanctions had been proposed, ignored, and forgotten. The Galactic Confederation had issued 3 formal statements of concern, which was their equivalent of screaming into the void while hoping someone would listen. And now, inevitably, the Ur-Nathi had dispatched their flagship, the Eternal Radiance, to demonstrate why one simply did not ignore Ur-Nathi property claim. Humanity had entered this complicated galactic stage approximately 40 cycles ago, emerging from their little blue marble in the unfashionable end of the Orion Spur, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they had no idea how thoroughly outgunned they were. The general consensus among established civilizations was that humans were adorably primitive, possessed of rudimentary faster-than-light travel and weapons that were, charitably speaking, adequate for hunting large animals but not much else. They had exactly 0 planet-killing devices, no gravitational wave manipulators, and their most powerful explosive devices could barely scratch a properly shielded asteroid. What humans did have, apparently, was an inexplicable talent for showing up at precisely the wrong moment. The diplomatic vessel Harmonious Convergence, a Folur ship hastily repurposed for emergency negotiations, currently housed representatives from 11 different species, all desperately attempting to convince the Ur-Nathi to perhaps not commit genocide today. Among this collection of galactic bureaucrats, scientists and military advisors sat a human, because humans had recently gained Confederation membership and were eager to participate in what they called peacekeeping operations. The human military advisor was a female specimen, approximately 30 standard cycles old, with the dark hair and brown skin typical of their planet's equatorial region. She had spent most of the 3-day journey reading technical manuals on Ur-Nathi weapons systems, which everyone else found either endearing or pointless, depending on their species' capacity for optimism. The Harmonious Convergence hung in space exactly 14,000 kilometers from the Eternal Radiance, which was the minimum safe distance for observing a Ur-Nathi flagship, without being considered an immediate threat. Through the viewport, the Ur-Nathi vessel resembled a massive crystalline cathedral, all sharp angles and refracted light, beautiful in the way that avalanches and hurricanes were beautiful, spectacular, terrible, and absolutely indifferent to your survival. The lead negotiator, a Folur elder whose carapace bore the scars of 6 previous failed diplomatic missions, had been transmitting increasingly desperate compromises for the past 2 hours. The Ur-Nathi response had been a masterclass in condescension. They would consider withdrawing their flagship if the Folur immediately abandoned all 47 disputed colonies, paid reparations equivalent to the gross domestic product of a small moon, and issued a formal apology that would be broadcast across all known civilizations. Also, They wanted the Falur to erect monuments celebrating Ur-Nathi magnanimity on each abandoned world. The Falur Elder had been preparing a counteroffer when the Eternal Radiance's primary weapon array began to glow. Every species had their own way of expressing existential dread. The Falur clicked their mandibles rapidly. The Threen delegation released pheromones that smelled like burning copper. The Falur representative's skin shifted through 7 different colors before settling on a gray that suggested complete resignation. Even the ship's artificial intelligence, normally limited to helpful navigational suggestions, released a digital sigh that somehow conveyed centuries of accumulated disappointment in biological decision-making. The human advisor stood up from her seat and walked toward the bridge viewport, her movements casual in a way that suggested she either did not understand the situation or understood it so completely that panic seemed redundant. The Annihilation Lance required approximately 90 seconds to reach full charge, a design feature the Ur-Nathi had implemented specifically to give their targets time to appreciate their impending obliteration. The weapon drew power directly from the flagship's miniaturized star core, channeling stellar fusion through crystalline focusing arrays that converted raw nuclear fury into a coherent beam of physics-defying destruction. When fired, it would cross 14,000 kilometers in less time than most biological beings required to process visual information. The Harmonious Convergence's shields, rated for micrometeorite impacts and perhaps the occasional hostile laser, would interact with an Annihilation Lance blast the way tissue paper interacted with a blowtorch. Every being aboard understood this fundamental reality. Their species had survived to reach spaceflight specifically because they understood when they were comprehensively outmatched. The human advisor tapped the communication panel with one finger, her voice carrying the kind of calm that seemed either deeply meditative or slightly unhinged. "This is going to sound strange," she said, addressing the bridge crew, "but I need someone to open the primary airlock." The Falur captain's translator implant briefly malfunctioned, producing a sound that resembled grinding metal, which was probably an accurate representation of what her neural pathways were attempting to process. Opening an airlock while facing down a charging planet-killer weapon, ranked somewhere between catastrophically stupid and evidence of severe neurological damage on the scale of tactical decision. Every species in the known galaxy understood that vacuum exposure was fatal, and more importantly entirely unhelpful when the problem involved an incoming lance of weaponized stellar fusion. "The human wishes to exit the vessel," the Threen science officer announced, his gelatinous form quivering with what might have been confusion or possibly the beginning stages of panic-induced liquefaction. "Perhaps the stress has triggered a psychotic break. I have read that humans sometimes experience reality distortions under extreme pressure." The human advisor was already moving toward the equipment bay, pulling on her species' primitive EVA suit with practiced efficiency. The suit itself was a laughable piece of technology by galactic standards, offering protection against vacuum and radiation that any properly evolved species would have handled with biological adaptations alone. It had exactly 0 defensive capabilities against energy weapons, military-grade projectiles, or particularly aggressive solar wind. The Annihilation Lance had reached 63% charge. Through the viewport, the Eternal Radiance glowed like a miniature sun, light refracting through its crystalline structure in patterns that would have been breathtaking if they were not currently the visual prelude to total annihilation. Standard protocol suggested using these final moments for prayer, final messages to loved ones, or perhaps a dignified acceptance of inevitable death. The universe operated on certain fundamental principles, and one of them was that when a Ur-Nathi flagship wanted you dead, you became dead. This was not negotiable. "Open the airlock," the human repeated, her voice carrying the kind of patience typically reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow children. She had sealed her helmet and was performing the pre-decompression check with movements that suggested she had done this thousands of times, which was statistically improbable given humanity's brief spacefaring history. The captain made a decision that she would spend the rest of her life, however brief that might be, attempting to rationalize. She authorized the airlock cycle. Perhaps the human had some classified escape technology, perhaps she knew something the rest of them did not, or perhaps watching a human voluntarily evacuate into space would provide a momentary distraction from their collective impending disintegration. The inner airlock door opened. The human stepped through, the door sealed behind her with the kind of finality that usually accompanied funeral. 81% charge. The Annihilation Lance had gone beyond glowing and had started to distort space-time in its immediate vicinity, bending light around the weapon's aperture in ways that made observing it directly uncomfortable. The Ur-Nathi were nothing if not theatrical about their genocide. The outer airlock cycled. The human drifted into the void between ships, using her suit's minimal thruster pack to orient herself directly in the weapon's firing path. Every species aboard the Harmonious Convergence watched through external cameras, their various biological processes frozen in collective incomprehension. The human spread her arms wide, positioned perpendicular to the lance's trajectory, floating in space like some ancient religious figure awaiting divine intervention. "She has gone completely insane," the Voltheri representative whispered, their skin now displaying colors that did not exist in standard visible spectrum, which happened when their species encountered situations so absurd that normal chromatic responses proved inadequate. 97% charge. The eternal radiance had become almost too bright to observe directly. Power readings were spiking across every sensor array, registering energy levels that made nuclear detonations look like birthday candles. The weapon's focusing crystals aligned with mathematical precision, targeting computers confirming that the Harmonious Convergence sat perfectly within the destruction cone. 3 seconds to full charge. 2 seconds. 1. The Annihilation Lance fired. What emerged from the Ur-Nathi flagship was not precisely a beam, though most species described it that way for lack of better terminology. It was a column of converted stellar matter, physics bent into shapes that made reality uncomfortable, energy compressed to densities that should not exist outside neutron stars. It crossed the 14,000 kilometers in 0.003 seconds, a streak of light that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The human caught it, not deflected, not absorbed by some hidden shield technology, caught it, with her hands the way one might catch a ball thrown by a child, if that ball happened to be composed of physics-breaking destruction, and the child was an ancient empire with a documented history of planetary annihilation. The energy bolt, planet-killer weapon, concentrated stellar fury, call it whatever terminology made the universe make sense again, simply stopped. It hung there in space, suspended between the human's outstretched palms, a writhing mass of light and heat that should have been converting everything within 500 kilometers into its component subatomic particles. The human suit should have vaporized instantly. Her body should have ceased existing in any meaningful way. The fundamental laws of thermodynamics should have been applying for emergency restraining order. Instead, the human rotated her body, a movement that looked almost lazy, certainly unconcerned, and redirected the bolt back toward its point of origin. The Annihilation Lance blast hit the Eternal Radiance's forward shields, with the kind of impact that registered on gravitational sensors 3 star systems away. The Ur-Nathi flagship, designed to withstand direct hits from everything short of supernovae, rocked backward, its crystalline structure fracturing along 6 major fault lines. Emergency power conduits exploded in cascades of light. The ship's miniaturized star core destabilized, forcing emergency containment fields to engage before the flagship converted itself into an impromptu nova. The human used her thruster pack to return to the airlock, moving with the same casual efficiency she had demonstrated leaving. The outer door cycled, the inner door opened. She removed her helmet and tucked it under one arm, her expression suggesting she had just completed a mildly tedious chore, rather than performing something that violated approximately 17 fundamental laws of physics. "That should give us some negotiating room," she said, her tone conversational, as if redirecting planet-killing weapons was standard diplomatic procedure. The Foluer captain's mandibles had locked in a position that veterinary xenobiologists would later classify as catastrophic existential shock. The Threen science officer had fully liquefied, his consciousness barely maintaining cohesion in a puddle on the deck. The Voltheri representative was cycling through colors that existed only in theoretical mathematics. Even the ship's artificial intelligence had crashed twice attempting to process the sensory data. The human walked back to her seat, sat down, and resumed reading her technical manual on Ur-Nathi weapons systems, as if the previous 3 minutes had been a minor interruption to more important work. In the silence that followed, broken only by the sound of the Threen officer slowly reconstituting himself, the Harmonious Convergence received an incoming transmission from the Eternal Radiance. The message was brief.
translated through 17 different linguistic matrices to ensure absolute clarity. The Urnathi Empire would be withdrawing all claims to the disputed territories, effective immediately, and would the diplomatic vessel please confirm that the human would not be doing that again?
The debriefing room had been designed by the Foluri, with their typical attention to ergonomic diversity, featuring adjustable seating for species ranging from gelatinous to crystalline, atmospheric controls that could accommodate methane breathers and oxygen dependence simultaneously, and calming bioluminescent panels that were supposed to reduce stress during difficult conversations. The panels were currently flickering erratically, as if the ship's systems themselves were experiencing some form of electronic anxiety disorder. 11 species representatives sat in a rough semicircle, all staring at the human advisor with expressions that ranged from abject terror to scientific fascination, with a healthy dose of existential confusion sprinkled throughout. The human had accepted a beverage that was technically toxic to her species but apparently tasted like bad coffee, which she seemed to consider a recommendation rather than a warning. The Folur captain initiated the discussion, her mandibles clicking with the careful precision of someone attempting to remain professional while every instinct screamed to flee to the nearest uninhabited star system. Perhaps you could explain what we witnessed in detail, using small words and frequent pauses, because I believe several of our neural pathways have sustained permanent damage. The human took another sip of her toxic beverage and shrugged, a gesture that apparently meant something casual in human body language, though it came across as deeply unsettling given recent events. Saw the weapon charging, figured someone should do something about it, so I did. You caught a planet-killing energy weapon, the Threen science officer said slowly, having finally reconstituted himself into something approximating his original form, though parts of him kept randomly liquefying whenever he made direct eye contact with the human. With your manipulator appendages, your unaugmented biological manipulator appendages. Hands, the human corrected helpfully. We call them hands. And yeah, it seemed like the most direct approach. The blast had a fairly predictable trajectory, and the energy matrix was actually pretty stable once I got a grip on it. Your sensors probably registered it as chaotic, but there was a clear harmonic frequency running through the core structure. The science officer produced a sound like boiling soup, which his translator rendered as high-pitched screaming. Energy matrices are not stable. They are, by definition, excited particles in aggressive states seeking thermodynamic equilibrium, which they achieve by converting anything they contact into matching energy states. This is not debatable. This is fundamental physics. Sure, but you have to account for consciousness affecting quantum probability fields, the human said, as if this were obvious, as if the entire foundation of scientific understanding had not just been casually demolished. My instructors back home covered this in basic training. If you maintain proper focus and account for the observer effect at macro scales, you can influence coherence patterns in high-energy systems. It is mostly about timing and not overthinking it. The Voltheri representative, who had finally settled on a color somewhere between nauseous purple and terrified ultraviolet, raised one appendage with the hesitant energy of someone asking a question they already knew would shatter their worldview further. Basic training. You learned this in military basic training. The ability to manipulate stellar-level energy outputs through consciousness alone. This is taught to your warriors as a fundamental skill. Not exactly alone. I mean, I was wearing my EVA rated for extreme radiation exposure, which helped with the initial thermal dispersal. The human paused, noticing the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. Is this not normal? Do other species not do? The silence intensified, somehow becoming more silent, achieving levels of quietness that approached philosophical concepts rather than merely acoustic phenomena. The human frowned, a facial expression indicating confusion or concern, though the assembled species were beginning to suspect that human expressions were wildly unreliable indicators of actual emotional states. How do you handle emergency situations in combat zone? If someone fires a weapon at your ship, you just let it hit. Yes. 17 voices simultaneously, in perfect harmony across multiple translation matrices. That is precisely what everyone in the known universe does, because energy weapons cannot be physically intercepted by biological entities without those entities ceasing to exist. The human absorbed this information with visible surprise. That explains why everyone was so shocked. I thought maybe I had violated some kind of diplomatic protocol. The Foliar captain felt something inside her carapace crack, though whether it was physical or psychological remained unclear. Protocol. You believed we were concerned about protocol. After watching you perform something that every scientific model in the galaxy confirms is impossible. I mean, humans have been doing this kind of thing for a while now. We just assumed everyone could and chose not to for tactical reasons or something. The human leaned back in her chair, the furniture creaking under her weight in ways that suddenly seemed ominous. We come from a heavy gravity world with a pretty aggressive biosphere. Evolution was rough. We had to develop durability and fast reflexes, just to survive long enough to reproduce. A drow biologist, who had remained silent until now, activated his translation device with trembling appendages. Define heavy gravity. Provide numerical specifications. Earth's surface gravity is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. The human recited from memory. Is that unusual? The biologist's 3 hearts stopped simultaneously, a medical condition that required immediate intervention from the ship's auto-dock system. While medical drones swarmed to prevent his death, the other representatives absorbed this information with dawning horror. The standard gravity for life-bearing worlds is between 3 and 5 meters per second squared. The Threen science officer whispered, his form beginning to lose cohesion again. Anything above 7 is considered incompatible with complex biological development. Your species evolved under nearly double the gravitational force that our models consider survivable. That explains why everything here feels so light. The human said brightly, I have been wondering why I kept accidentally breaking door handles and chairs. I thought your construction standards were just really poor. The Volthari representative's skin had now achieved a color that physicists would later classify as technically impossible, but optically verified. What else can your species do? What other capabilities have you been casually not mentioning, because you assumed everyone shared them? The human considered this question, with the thoughtful expression of someone mentally reviewing a long list. Well, we can survive significant trauma, broken bones, lacerations, even some organ damage if we get medical attention within a few hours. Our bodies have redundant systems and aggressive healing responses. Oh, and we can function normally under conditions that would kill most species. In temperature extremes, radiation exposure, toxic atmospheres, that sort of thing. For how long? The captain asked, her voice barely audible. Depends on the severity. Minutes to hours, usually. Sometimes days if we are properly motivated. The human paused. Is this the wrong answer? Everyone looks upset. The drow biologist, having been revived by medical drones, spoke with the weak voice of someone whose fundamental understanding of xenobiology had been shattered and hastily glued back together incorrect. Most species die within seconds of exposure to conditions outside their narrow environmental parameters. Our biology is optimized for specific conditions, because evolution favors specialization. You are describing adaptive capabilities that should not exist in complex organisms. Oh, that makes sense. Humans are generalists, not specialists. We evolved to survive in multiple environments because our planet kept trying to kill us in creative ways. The human finished her toxic beverage and set the container down with enough force to crack the table. Sorry about that. Still adjusting to the lighter construction. The assembled representatives stared at the cracked table, then at the human, then at each other, engaging in the kind of silent communication that transcended language and achieved distilled understanding. They had invited an apex predator from a nightmare world into their civilization, and given her diplomatic credentials. The human seemed to notice the extended silence, and offered what was probably meant to be a reassuring smile, though it displayed an unsettling number of bone-white teeth. If it helps, this was not the first time I have had to intercept weapons fire. Last year during that pirate incident near the Helix Nebula, I redirected a railgun barrage, and there was that situation with the antimatter mine that someone had to manually disarm. Pretty standard stuff for security operations. Standard, the captain repeated, her voice hollow. You consider these standard operations? Sure. I mean, if you see a threat developing, you address it,
That is basic crisis management. The human stood, her movement fluid despite the catastrophic revelations she had been casually dispensing. Anyway, I should file my incident report. Do you need anything else from me? What they needed, the assembled species realized, was to completely reevaluate humanity's threat classification, update their contact protocols, and possibly reconsider every interaction they had ever had with humans through the new lens of terrifying competence. What they said was, "No, that will be all, thank you." The human left the debriefing room, and in her absence, the representative sat in stunned silence, contemplating a universe that suddenly seemed far more dangerous and far less predictable than it had been that morning. The footage spread through the galactic information networks, with the kind of viral intensity usually reserved for celebrity scandals or the discovery of new fundamental particles. Within 6 standard hours, every major civilization had received copies of the external camera recording, each frame analyzed by increasingly panicked scientific committees, who kept arriving at the same impossible conclusion. The human had actually done that, and physics had apparently decided to take a personal day. On the Yrnathi homeworld, a planet of crystalline spires and refracted starlight, the Imperial High Command convened an emergency session for the first time in 4,000 cycles. The chamber, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the Empire's eternal dominance, felt considerably less impressive now that everyone present had watched a soft-bodied biped casually return their most powerful weapon, like a child throwing a ball back over a fence. "Proposal," the war coordinator announced, their crystalline form vibrating with frequencies that translated as barely suppressed panic. "We immediately reclassify humanity as a Class Omega threat, and establish a minimum safe distance of 50 light-years from all human-occupied systems." Seconded. 17 voices chimed simultaneously. Counter-proposal, the Imperial Eldest added, their ancient structure flickering with the kind of light patterns that indicated deep philosophical consideration. "We establish formal non-aggression treaties with humanity, offer them preferential trade agreements, and perhaps quietly suggest that we have always valued peaceful coexistence over military expansion." The vote passed unanimously, which represented the fastest diplomatic reversal in Yrnathi history, beating the previous record by approximately 3,900 cycles. Across the Faux-Lure Concordat, emergency broadcasts interrupted regular programming, showing the footage on endless repeat, while xenobiologists, tempted to explain how this was theoretically possible and failed spectacularly. The leading theory proposed by their most respected scientist, and immediately adopted because it was the only explanation that did not require rewriting every text, suggested that humans were the result of an ancient genetic engineering project by some long-extinct precursor civilization that had possessed a deeply irresponsible attitude toward biological safety protocols. The Threen Collective, whose entire civilization was built on the principle of cautious scientific inquiry and avoiding unnecessary risks, issued a species-wide advisory recommending that all Threen citizens maintain polite but distant relationships with humans, avoid startling them, and under no circumstances engage in competitive sports or physical challenges. The advisory included helpful tips, such as never make direct eye contact for longer than 3 seconds, and if a human offers to help with heavy lifting, accept graciously and retreat to a safe distance. The Drow Communion, still recovering from their biologist's triple cardiac arrest, commissioned an extensive study of human evolutionary history. What they discovered made the energy bolt incident seem almost reasonable by comparison. Humanity had evolved on a world where the local predators included creatures weighing multiple tons with enough bite force to crush steel, microscopic organisms that could shut down biological systems in hours, and weather patterns that could level cities. Humans had not simply survived this environment. They had dominated it so thoroughly that they had to create artificial conservation zones to prevent themselves from accidentally hunting everything else to extinction. They are persistence predators, the lead researcher reported to the Communion Council, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back with bipedal efficiency. Their ancestors would chase prey animals until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, They can regulate their internal temperature through liquid excretion, allowing them to function in conditions that would kill most species through heat stroke. They evolved to run down and outlast everything else on their planet. The council sat in horrified silence before one member raised a appendage with a trembling gesture. Question: are we prey animals in human classification? The researcher consulted his data, then delivered the answer that would fundamentally reshape Drow foreign policy for the next century. In terms of endurance, environmental adaptability, and ability to withstand physical trauma, every species in the known galaxy qualifies as prey compared to humans. They are the only apex predators to achieve spaceflight. In the Volthari Assembly, where decisions were traditionally made through lengthy consensus-building processes that could take years, the leadership reached a conclusion in 17 minutes. Humanity would receive immediate elevation to Tier 1 civilization status, full voting rights in all galactic matters, and a politely worded request that they please consider not catching any more weapons until the rest of the galaxy had time to adjust their threat assessment protocol. But perhaps the most significant response came from the Galactic Confederation's Central Intelligence Bureau, an organization dedicated to monitoring potential threats to interstellar stability. Their analysts had been reviewing humanity's brief history in galactic politics with new perspective, and what they found was terrifying. The pirate incident near the Helix Nebula that the human advisor had mentioned in passing. Records showed that a human merchant vessel had been attacked by raiders, using military-grade plasma weapons. The human crew had reportedly disabled the attacking ships. The official report described it as Lucky Shield Harmonic. The newly declassified footage showed humans in EVA suits physically boarding the pirate vessels mid-combat, tearing through armored hulls with tools that were technically rated for emergency repairs, and subduing the raiders through what could only be described as aggressive physical negotiation. The antimatter mine incident. A human engineer had apparently noticed the device attached to a space station's hull during a routine maintenance walk. The station's automated systems had failed to detect it. The human had simply walked over, examined it for 30 seconds, then manually disconnected the detonation mechanism, while her colleagues watched with what they later described as mild concern rather than the absolute screaming terror that any rational species would have experienced. There was the situation on the Brecon colony where a structural failure had trapped 17 beings under debris that weighed approximately 4 tons. Human relief workers had arrived first and, rather than waiting for proper lifting equipment, had simply lifted the debris themselves while sustaining what they described as minor bruising, and what medical scanners indicated was enough tissue damage to hospitalize most species for months. The pattern was clear and absolutely horrifying. Humans had been performing physically impossible feats on a regular basis, and treating them as mundane problem-solving, rather than reality-defying miracles. They thought everyone could do this, an analyst whispered, reviewing the debriefing transcript. They genuinely believed that catching energy weapons and lifting multi-ton objects was normal behavior that other species simply chose not to engage in for strategic reasons. The director of threat assessment, a being who had served through 6 major wars and 3 near-extinction events without losing their composure, put their head-equivalent appendage on their desk and made a sound that the translator rendered as existential weep. Update humanity's classification. Threat level, unknown. Potential catastrophic. Recommended action. Maintain friendly relations at all costs and hope they continue to find us useful. The report went out to every member civilization within the hour, along with newly updated contact protocols that included helpful suggestions, like always be honest with humans, as they can apparently survive interrogation techniques that would liquefy most species. And if a human volunteers for a dangerous task, let them handle it because they will probably succeed in ways that violate your understanding of physics. On Earth, blissfully unaware that she had single-handedly reshaped galactic politics, the human advisor filed her incident report using the standard diplomatic format. Under action taken, she wrote, intercepted hostile weapons fire and returned to sender. Situation resolved peacefully. No casualties. Under lessons learned, she added, your Nathi energy weapons have interesting harmonic structure. would recommend further study for potential defensive applications. Her supervisor, a human commander with 20 years of military experience, approved the report without comment because, from a human perspective, this was indeed standard crisis management. Another Tuesday in the peaceful vacuum of space. Meanwhile, in an orbital habitat around the Draal homeworld, a human construction worker named Hayes was casually welding hull sections together in hard vacuum, working through his lunch break because the job was almost done, and he wanted to finish this section before knocking off for the day. His Draal supervisor watched through remote cameras, their 3 hearts beating in stressed syncopation, as the human handled materials that should have required a full construction mech, and safety protocols that the humans seemed to consider optional suggestions. Are all humans like this? The supervisor asked their human liaison, a female specimen who was currently eating something called a sandwich that contained enough sodium to kill a Draal through osmotic shock. Like what? She replied, genuinely confused. Capable of performing tasks that should require heavy machinery, while treating mortal danger as a minor inconvenience. The human liaison considered this, taking another bite of her lethal sandwich. I guess we are pretty hands-on as a species. Hayes is actually being careful today. Last week he caught a falling beam that would have crushed the crew, saved everyone like 15 minutes of cleanup time. The Draal supervisor filed an immediate request for transfer to a project on the opposite side of the galaxy, then revised it to a different galaxy entirely, just to be safe. And across the vast expanse of space, in diplomatic vessels and military installations, research stations and trade hubs, the galactic community came to understand a fundamental truth that would reshape interstellar relations for millennia to come. Humanity had not earned their place at the galactic table through technology or cunning, or ancient wisdom. They had earned it by being the universe's most terrifying accident, a species of nearly indestructible persistence predators, who had somehow convinced themselves that everyone else was equally capable and just choosing to be cautious. The irony, lost on humanity but painfully obvious to everyone else, was that humans had spent their first 40 cycles in space, apologizing for their primitive technology and trying to catch up to civilizations that were now desperately hoping humans never realized just how comprehensively outmatched everyone else actually was. In the end, the galaxy learned to coexist with humanity, the same way prey animals learn to coexist with predators. Carefully, respectfully, and with the constant awareness that the only reason they were not lunch was because the predators had decided to be vegetarians today. Metaphorically speaking, though several species did start checking whether humans actually were vegetarians, and the resulting discovery that humans were omnivores who could digest nearly anything organic triggered another wave of diplomatic anxiety that would take decades to fully process. But that, as they say, is a story for another time.